I really grew up with this idea that the war on drugs was my generation's Vietnam or something, this war that didn't make sense. It impacted a lot of people's lives negatively, very costly, but you had to sort of go along with it. And so I met with my law school guidance counselors, and they said it would be career suicide, right, to go into cannabis. Would be a red mark on my record that would follow me around forever. And my goal was to be the guy in the courthouse that knew more about the cannabis laws, the medical cannabis laws, than anyone that had ever walked in the building, including the judge. Invariably, they regulate it like it's plutonium, like it's the most dangerous thing. 10 years from now, there will be intoxicating THC beverages everywhere alcohol is sold in this country. Every restaurant, bar, the grocery store, right next to Budweiser will be, cannabis beverages.
This is the Litigator's Edge, the podcast where smart strategy, practical innovation, and real-world experience come together to move litigation forward. Each week, we sit down with attorneys, legal tech leaders, and trusted advisors who are rethinking how great legal work gets done. You'll hear how law firms are building a competitive advantage. These conversations are grounded, insightful, and designed to help you refine how you work and how you win. Here is your host, Aniket Sawant.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of The Litigator's Edge, the podcast where innovative attorneys reveal the strategies that have transformed their legal practice. My name is Aniket Sawant, and I'm co-founder and CEO of Threadio. My guest today is a founding partner of the country's first powerhouse cannabis law firm and is widely regarded as one of the architects of the modern legal cannabis industry. As co-author of the constitutional amendment that made Colorado the first jurisdiction in the world to legalize and regulate marijuana for adult use, he's been called the industry's de facto spokesman by none other than The Guardian. It is my pleasure to welcome Brian Vicente to the podcast. Welcome, Brian, and thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Aniket. Thanks so much.
Well, I wanted to start, Brian, by asking you the same question that I ask all of my guests, which is, can you please share a fun fact or a cringe joke? Which will it be and what is it?
A fun fact, during the pandemic, I had 3,000 pounds of wood delivered to my house, and my pandemic project was building a halfpipe, a skateboard ramp in my backyard. I've been a big skateboarder my whole life, and that's a lot of people learn a new language or pottery during the pandemic, but what I did was build a skateboard. So
that's amazing. That's amazing. Did you call Tony Hawk over?
Yeah, he never answered my calls.
He should know better. That's awesome. Fantastic. Well, that is a fun and very interesting fact. Thank you for sharing that. Brian, I like to think of every attorney who makes the time to be on this podcast as a superhero, and every superhero has an origin story, and yours is very interesting. What is it, and can you please share?
Sure. So I'm a sort of unique animal in that I've been working full-time on cannabis law for, I think this is my 21st year. I really kind of grew up with this idea that the war on drugs was sort of my generation's Vietnam or something, this war that didn't make sense. It impacted a lot of people's lives negatively, very costly, but you had to sort of go along with it. And, when I found an opportunity to work on cannabis reform and really work on behalf of medical marijuana patients and creating a regulatory structure, I really dove in head first. And so for many, many years, I was working in this area of law that didn't quite exist. It was sort of criminal defense, but have been fortunate enough to be part of a group of us that have developed this into a legitimate legal practice that now is, we have cannabis legal in 24 states, 40 states for medical, and then a number of countries that have come on board with legalizing cannabis. It's been my life's work, and it continues to grow every year.
That's amazing. So did you decide, or did you determine that this was something that you wanted to do straight out of law school? What was that moment where you said to yourself, hey, this is what I want to do, and this is what I want my life's work to be?
So I had a real intellectual interest in the topic, and I found it really interesting. And it's one of those things, the more you learned about the war on drugs, you're like, wait a second, this isn't accomplishing any of its goals, and it's very costly. But I met with my law school guidance counselors, and they said it would be career suicide, right, to go into cannabis. Would be a red mark on my record that would follow me around forever. And so that was disheartening. Having said that, there's a small number of kind of social justice sort of attorneys that fostered my interest in this space. And then a nonprofit called the Marijuana Policy Project, which is actually it's a 501c3. It's federally recognized, been around for 30 years. They sort of tapped me to do some work in the space on the nonprofit level, and it really took off from there. I mean, my goal was to be the guy in the courthouse that knew more about the cannabis laws and the medical cannabis laws than anyone that had ever walked in the building. Didn't mean I was the best lawyer when I was a first, second, third year lawyer, but it meant I knew more about this than anyone else, including the judge. And because I was able to sort of flex that tiny bit of our state constitution and say, hey, there are rights for patients here, there are rights for caregivers and citizens, we were able to expand those laws and really get them sort of embraced by the state and ultimately by other states.
That's amazing. Can you give us a timeline of your career, coming out of law school where that counselor told you about, career suicide, right up to Amendment 64, which we'll get into in a little bit, but how long were you in the sort of in this very gray zone before the legitimacy of Amendment 64?
Yeah, 8 years that I sort of fought in the trenches from 2004 until 2012. During that time, I worked full time on trying to change local cannabis laws, right, through running ballot initiatives or lobbying campaigns. But I also did a lot of impact legal work, right? So I would sue the state to try to expand medical marijuana patient rights. I would represent people who were 95 pounds and were dying of AIDS, but wanted to access medical cannabis. And then I would intentionally get these stories in the news, right? And it's pretty hard to turn your back on the guy who's dying of AIDS and just wants to smoke cannabis so his stomach doesn't hurt and he can take the rest of his pills to keep him alive. Getting those stories out. Sometimes I'd win those cases, sometimes we'd fight and lose. But the point was it was a concerted effort to educate the public on what was going on. I also sued the state to allow an expansion of our patient caregiver law in 2008, 2009. The long and short is our law in Colorado allowed like a flesh and blood individual to, who's 21 and over, to grow cannabis for another individual, but they're capping the number of folks that caregiver could help at 5. And so I got the DEA and the state on the stand and said, why 5? Why not 6? Why can't this individual help 3 people? Why not 17? And ultimately the judge threw that out. And that was a landmark case that then allowed a caregiver, a state designated person, to help 5,000, 10,000 individuals. And that was how people began opening stores, right? So that's how the first medical cannabis dispensaries got going. So all this was groundwork that we were laying to help prepare our state, get these stories out, educate the public, prepare the state for the 2012 legalization push, which, I co-chaired that campaign. I was one of the lead authors and we won, right?
That's amazing. So that's a great segue into the 2012 campaign for Amendment 64. So can you take us into, obviously you had these activities that as you mentioned were the lead up, but what did you specifically have to do to make this, changing the constitution of any entity is not a trivial task. So what was that war room, so to speak? What was it like there? And then what was this biggest specific legal or political challenge that you had to overcome to actually get that onto the ballot and then turn it into law?
Yeah, so it was an exciting time. There were a small group of us that have been working full time in Colorado to educate the public, change the laws, help medical marijuana patients, popularize the issue. And because we had been successful on a shoestring, we were able to bring in a decent amount of funding. And you need a decent amount of funding in order to place a measure on the statewide ballot, right? So I think we spent maybe $1 million on this whole campaign, maybe a little more. But that's gathering signatures, getting on the ballot. And then we had to remain scrappy and sort of do earned media stunts and strategic billboards and things like that to drive interest into the cause. The opposition really was 100 years of prohibition. It had simply never been done. So a lot of people didn't take us very seriously. Even though we won local battles in Denver, it doesn't mean that you're going to change the course of prohibition. But so we essentially had every government entity working against us, whether that's law enforcement or the governor at the time, really coming out and saying this is a bad idea. But we were able to educate the public and ultimately won by a 10-point margin.
That's amazing. Let's look at the timeline post post the legalization. So obviously you had to help build the regulatory structure from the ground up, which I would imagine is a different set of responsibilities from fighting in the trenches, because now you are almost a part of the new establishment that had made this happen. So what was that transition like for you, from being sort of the challenger to sort of being not the incumbent, but at least somebody in a position to actually make those decisions?
Yeah, that was powerful. I'll say this, pretty much every elected official, law enforcement agent came out publicly against our measure. But when we won and the voters said we want to experiment with legalization in Colorado, my phone just did not stop ringing. And there was a lot of those same people that had opposed us that said, "Hey, I'm a public servant. I didn't support this, but my voters passed this. I'd like to talk to you about how we can do this right." And that was really powerful for me and a sort of learning experience. I was fortunate then to sit on the governor's task force while we sat down and decided how to come up with the regulations around this product that had been largely illegal for 100 years, right? And that was really fascinating. That I'd be sitting in rooms with, a member of the Department of Justice, but also someone that had grown cannabis in their garage for 20 years, who was a subject matter expert, right? And we'd bring people together to say, "Hey, what can we agree on? We don't want kids getting this. We want clear labeling. We want testing." And you'd be surprised. Like, those were productive conversations by people that were trying to do the best thing for society with the law that the voters had passed.
Amazing. You mentioned that cannabis obviously was legal in Colorado first and now 24 states. How do you approach the challenge of creating a legal and regulatory framework, or how would you for an entire nation? Obviously, there's the 24 states, but there's obviously 26 that remain, and territories and things like that. When you think about, to the extent that you think about expanding this framework across the nation, what do you think are some key lessons from the Colorado model, so to speak, that are salient, and then some things that you would potentially do differently?
Yeah. Yeah. So it was really interesting, right? I mean, we were taking a product that had been essentially illegal for 100 years and trying to figure out how to regulate it, right? And so, there were people who said, "Hey, we should regulate it like tomatoes. You should be able to grow it in your backyard if you're, 17." And, fortunately, the sort of voices of reason won out. And we said, "Let's regulate this like alcohol." The American public understands that alcohol is for people 21 and older, that it's tested, that it's regulated, that it's, not being sold by bootleggers anymore. And so that's basically the framework that we use. And we housed Colorado's law under the Department of Revenue, which also oversees liquor, and said, there's different license types. And these, whether for growers or manufacturers, producers, transporters, we set up a robust set of regulations for each of those, including, cameras and things, and making sure that the products weren't diverted, and, safety standards for production. And it worked, right? And so that model has largely been exported, and we've been fortunate as a law firm to work in a lot of different states and a couple different countries to try to help establish regulations that work for those communities. And a lot of that kind of backbone came out of Colorado.
Fascinating. You mentioned a couple of different countries. What countries are you working with, and what are some similarities and differences in terms of the landscape in those countries?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier after we legalized cannabis, my phone started ringing, and some of those phone calls were from like Vicente Fox, the former president of Mexico, like German delegations that wanted to come over and learn about what we were up to. And it was remarkable. Like, basically what we had done was show the world that this idea was possible, right? That prohibition did not have to be the only path forward. Now, it doesn't mean that Germany wanted to adopt our model, but they wanted to learn about alternatives to prohibition, right? And so we kind of crystallized the idea that there could be more than prohibition for individuals or for different countries. Subsequently, I was fortunate to work with the country of Uruguay. I was flown down there at sort of the behest of the vice president, and did some panels and speaking engagements and lobbying types activities. And they ultimately became the first country to legalize cannabis. So that was a wonderful experience. We also advised Canada in their sort of transition, and now they have adult legal cannabis as well. And have played informal roles with various other sort of European nations and so forth. But I do think more and more countries are getting bored on with this policy, and realizing that there's revenue, and just prohibition is not a working policy. And why should we punish adults for choosing cannabis? And in fact, let's tax this and make jobs.
Makes sense. Let's switch gears a little bit to sort of the business of running a firm. So obviously, Vicente LLP is regarded as the country's first powerhouse marijuana law firm. So going back to clearly disregarding what that law school counselor said, what were some key strategic decisions that you made back in those early days when it was a less a less welcoming environment than it is today, that enabled you to not only survive but thrive and then become one of the leading voices on the other side of the legislation?
Yeah, so our firm's model, I started doing this in 2004. The current law firm, Vicente, is roughly 2009. Our model has not really changed a ton in that we get involved early in different states, cities, countries, and help to change the laws on cannabis, hemp, medical marijuana. We actually wrote the psychedelics bill that passed in Colorado a couple of years ago. And not only is that sort of mission driven for us, we believe that those are good laws to pass for various reasons, but then it sort of assists with our rise to prominency because we can say, hey, we helped write this law in Massachusetts. The law passed. We helped with the campaign. Who would you like to talk to about setting up a business under this law? Clearly it's us, right? Like we're the ones that like wrote the law or assisted with the drafting and so forth. And that's really been our business model. We did that in Colorado. We did it in Massachusetts. We do it in a bunch of different states. And then we provide basic kind of business legal services. And we still represent a number of governments and tribal governments and, local governments is really interesting work. But the bulk of our work is really, it's business, incorporation, basically business law 101 for these cannabis, hemp, and psychedelic companies.
Makes sense. What are some lessons that maybe non-cannabis lawyers and law firm owners can take from what you did, in your opinion? Because obviously writing laws for a new sort of a new space or a new push is unique and greenfield, but there are some fundamentals, to your point, the business 101. So what would some of those be?
Yeah, I mean, one of the sort of hyper focused things in cannabis is that every state has done it a little bit differently. Every municipality has their own rules. Now, lawyers are used to sort of navigating zoning rules for this city or, statewide regs. But just knowing that in any sort of national practice here, it requires a fluency in how not only what the regulations are in that market, but how the regulators are interpreting those, because it's new, right? It's like, I started this work 20 years ago, but just a couple of years ago, well, we had different states legalize cannabis. Like it's they're writing these rules kind of as we speak. So really remaining as sort of in touch as you can in sort of shifting regulation. And from there, there's a degree of prejudice against these business owners. They may have difficulty with banking. Their tax codes are different than others they have to follow. So really, I think it's difficult for individuals to kind of put their toe in. But if they are fully committed to a practice in this space, I find it very rewarding. It's fun to be part of like a cutting edge legal practice.
Makes sense. To the point of cutting edge. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit towards talking about innovation. Now, I normally this is a section where I talk with attorneys about the use of innovation in their practice, but I would argue that in your case, your entire career has been one giant innovation. But that being said, what are some ways, some processes, some maybe more tactical ways in which you use innovative strategies, and that doesn't have to be, technology or AI, although that's a component of it, but strategies that you use and have used to get get results that you want?
Yeah, I would say much of my career has been working on sort of innovating new areas of law. And as such, our firm has really embraced AI and the sort of changing legal landscape. I think you have to, right? I've seen this go awry for some attorneys, not in my firm, but folks that are having AI draft briefs and so forth. But I do think we use AI in a number of ways that are quite helpful. I mean, one is for us, isolating AI searches within Lexis or Westlaw, where if you just ask ChatGPT a legal question, like the universe they're looking at is so crazy that you're going to get false information, false sites. If the universe is limited to what Lexis has or what Westlaw has, you can really rely quite a bit more on the answers they're providing for you. So this is something we use almost daily, right? Now that doesn't mean that even though I asked yesterday, the Lexus AI about Vermont regulations and how to define a quote affiliate as related to cannabis businesses, it doesn't mean I'm going to rely on that 100%, but it's about 90% right, and they can do in 10 minutes what would take us a couple hours to come through the Vermont code and what's similar to affiliate and so forth. So that's been an excellent sort of tool for us, and I think it's only going to get better and better. We also use Everlaw, which is an AI sort of generative tool for discovery assistance. We have a pretty robust litigation practice. They do impacts litigation. They do one-on-one business sort of transactional and business disputes is a lot of what we see. That particular software, it can take something that discovery review that might take 10 hours or 10 days. You can feed it. You pay per gigabyte. And then you can ask the questions. Give me every email that this person touched. Who did they not touch in those emails? Is there a gap in their chronology that perhaps the other side hasn't shown us those emails yet? And we should ask about it. So I think there's amazing tools in terms of litigation. We're at the front edge of it. But, as a firm that really prides itself on being on the cutting edge of various legal issues, we've been diving.
That's pretty cool. What do you think? Clearly, so you're innovative, not just in terms of your practice area, but also in your use of these tools, which is amazing. What is the biggest misconception you think that fellow attorneys, maybe not in cannabis, maybe outside of it, have about integrating AI into their practice? And it might manifest itself in the form of those drafts and citations and so forth. But what is your understanding of misconceptions that you believe your colleagues have?
Well, I do think to some extent, assuming that all AIs are the same and that you're going to get the same level of accuracy from ChatGPT versus Westlaw's AI, I think that's something to keep an eye on. I do think a concern that our colleagues have and others is all these note takers that are showing up on calls every day, fireflies and so forth. How is that information being used? We're actually, as a firm, pretty uncomfortable with clients using these transcription services. So navigating that, those are some of the hot issues we're seeing.
Makes sense. Thinking about misconception, now we'll sort of bring it back to your bread and butter, which is cannabis. So, what is the biggest misconception today that lawmakers as well as the general public still have about the regulated cannabis industry? And as the Guardian mentioned, the industry's de facto spokesman, what is one thing that you wish that everybody sort of understood about the business and the regulation of cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I haven't worked on this for a couple decades. We still have new states that are moving forward regulating this, and invariably they regulate it like it's plutonium, like it's the most dangerous thing, and we've got to tag it every second, and we've got to track who's buying it and using it. And I'm not saying there aren't safety standards that are here. We should follow basically the same safety standards as alcohol. As we move further and further from prohibition, there's less need for people to redistribute cannabis, right? It's like you can buy it at a store. Why would you buy it on a street corner or buy it and ship it across the state if the other side of the state is legal too, right? So I just think we need to address this as a sort of another, as any other intoxicant in our country would be addressed, and not over-regulate. We do need to appropriately regulate, but not over-regulate. These over-regulation play out where, I have clients that are building let's just say a 50,000 square foot cultivation facility. You have to put in a couple $1 million worth of cannabis, and it just seems, that's a big barrier, right? If you're anyone who's not a millionaire, and it just makes it that much harder for these businesses to succeed. And then that's just one part of the supply chain. People can't afford to open those stores because of the security requirements or compliance requirements. Well, then the rest of the supply chain's in trouble too. I think sort of, calming down on the excessive regulation.
It makes sense. Assuming we do get to a world where the excessive regulations are sort of calmer, where do you see the greatest opportunities for innovation in the cannabis industry? You mentioned supply chains. So what are some areas where you think that, hey, in a world where regulation was, in your opinion, quote unquote, more reasonable, where do you think the cannabis industry could go against that backdrop?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a bit of a revolution going on within the cannabis world, in that you have a rise of a sector that was sort of previously almost unknown. If you talk to people that consumed cannabis for years and years and years, it's almost always smoked cannabis or maybe gummies. But really, we've seen a absolute just meteoric rise of beverages in the cannabis space. And my prediction, Aniket, is 10 years from now, if and when we talk again, there will be intoxicating THC beverages everywhere alcohol is sold in this country. Every restaurant, every bar, every grocery store, right next to that, right next to Budweiser will be, cannabis beverages. And we're already seeing this in a couple dozen states, right? So you have 5,000 bars in Minnesota where I could walk up and get a Fat Tire beer, or I could order a 5 milligram THC drink. And the public is really embracing this, right? So I think that's sort of the revolution we're going to see. And with that, we work with increasingly a lot of larger alcohol conglomerates that are looking at the space, that are recognizing that alcohol sales are down. A lot of the younger folks are more interested in wellness products or what have you, and they're turning to cannabis. And the American public is very used to having intoxicants in drink form, whether that's Red Bull or beer or wine or whatever. So adding THC outlets to that, right, and bars, restaurants, convenience stores, what have you, seems to be the natural kind of evolution.
Makes a lot of sense. Brian, this has been a fantastic conversation. Just a couple of quick questions to sort of wrap this up. One is, if I'm a younger attorney starting off and looking at the broad landscape, societal, technological, AI, and then cannabis, what advice or guidance would you have for somebody like that who is potentially considering making the same move that you made almost, more than 2 decades ago?
Well, I think, sort of the key to life is, there's a technological piece, but I've found just showing up. If there's hearings in your city or town on cannabis, or psychedelics is another issue we work on. If that's a cutting edge issue to you, if you're able to, read the AI generative summaries, fill your brain with that, show up and just start networking with people and advocating for issues you care about, I think you can find yourself a fulfilling legal career.
Fantastic. For those who may be less familiar with the industry, what are a couple of go-to resources that you would recommend? Where can an attorney or even a layperson start to learn more about the industry and everything within it?
Yeah, I require every member of my staff, and there's about 100 of us, to subscribe to a daily newsletter called the Marijuana Moment. It's a free newsletter, but it really breaks down state by state, issue by issue, city by city, what's going on with cannabis. I find that to be super helpful. So there's newsletters like that. I think if you want to sort of look at the history, something like The Emperor Wears No Clothes by Jack Harrow, which has been around for, probably 50 years at this point, just provides some of the background on how we got here, the sort of reefer madness. It doesn't quite get into how we are feeling our way out of that, but provide a lot of the history of the cannabis plant and prohibition. And it's interesting to read about the history so you can understand what's in it.
Thank you for sharing that. Final question for you, Brian. Is there a question I should have asked you, but I didn't?
Not that I can think of. I thought that was a great conversation.
Well, thank you for that great conversation too, Brian. I appreciate your time. I'm sure our audience will enjoy this, this deep dive from one of the authorities in the space. So thank you again, Brian, and hope to talk to you again soon.
My pleasure.
The Litigator's Edge podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.